Chapter 9. Misty hated being trapped at her sister's apartment. There was no gym on the first floor, so no workout. She decided to kill time by cleaning, but Summer had scrubbed the place thoroughly before relocating to New Hampshire, so that didn't take nearly enough time. She tried TV, but what was the appeal of watching other people live their lives instead of accomplishing something of her own? She yearned to go for a walk, but the whole point of going to Summer's was to convince whoever had broken into her place that she was out of town. The likelihood of her being spotted by some dangerous enemy was slim, but it was possible. Between fear of that, her constant anxiety at being out in the open after being snatched off the street less than 2 months before, and her need to have bodyguards accompany her wherever she went, she chose to stay indoors and out of sight. She dug into the Dawson/Thornbrook case, but didn't find much. Tate would have better luck from the office, where it would be simpler to tap into county resources. Obviously, Misty had been working too hard if taking a few hours off on a Sunday was so challenging. Which was why she wasn't sorry when she received a call from Melanie Castellan, the former girlfriend and current stalking victim of Kyle Griffin, a case set to go to trial on Wednesday. Despite the intruder in her apartment, Misty would be there. No other ADA would care as much as she did. She owed it to the abuse victim. "Tony changed his mind," Melanie said in lieu of hello. "What? Why?" "Wouldn't say. He just said he has to focus on his family." Melanie's flat tone worried Misty more than if she'd sounded distraught or angry. She seemed resigned to what was coming. Until her call, Misty had felt confident in her ability to secure a conviction against Melanie's abusive ex-boyfriend. Tony, Melanie's brother, was the only person who'd witnessed Kyle Griffin abusing Melanie and threatening her children. Without his testimony, the trial would be a case of he said, she said. She'd never spoken with Griffin, but she understood he was charming, whereas Melanie might come off as coarse and defensive. A jury could be swayed by Kyle's lies. "Tony is scheduled to be deposed tomorrow," Misty said. "You're saying he won't show up?" "Said he no longer remembers anything." "You have to change his mind. It's imperative that he testify. I'll issue a subpoena, but he has to show up." "He said he won't." Melanie's voice pitched higher. "He said, he's not going to do it, Ms. Lake. He's not going to change his mind." "Why?" "Kyle must have threatened him. Tony's got kids. He's not going to put them at risk for me. Why would he?" "Because she was his sister. Because it was the right thing to do." "I'll call him," Misty said. Maybe she could sway him. If not, her case was rocky at best. Even if she gave in to Tate's suggestion that she offer a plea deal, why would Griffin take it, knowing he had such a good shot at being acquitted? She ended the call and immediately dialed Tony. He didn't answer. No surprise. "I talked to your sister," she said to his voicemail. "Please call me back. We need to discuss our options." Maybe he'd call her back if he thought there was a way to help his sister without putting himself at risk. There was nothing else Misty could do. She paced and worried and watched the clock, eager for Tate to arrive. It was nearly 5 o'clock before she heard a knock, and then Tate's voice. "It's me." She disengaged the alarm and deadbolt and opened the door. He stepped in past the guard. "Groceries and dinner." He wore jeans and a t-shirt that hugged his strong biceps as he lifted a couple of paper bags. His hair was artfully messy, his blue eyes warm as he smiled at her. A bit of scruff on his jaw told her he hadn't shaved. Rather than detract from his good looks, the stubble only made him look ruggedly charming. She took the bags, ignoring a jolt of awareness when their fingers touched, and headed for the kitchen. Summer had remodeled this room, replacing what Misty would guess had been old, drab cabinets with white ones, some of which were glass-fronted and displayed pretty plates and platters and glasses. The countertop was granite in shades of brown and rust, the backsplash white subway tiles. The whole space was fresh and new despite the age of the old brownstone. "What do I owe you?" "Grocery receipts in the bag." He'd slipped off his backpack and dropped it on a chair. At the counter, he pulled food from the sacks, which she stowed in the fridge and cabinets. He'd brought enough to last a few days. She'd need to place a delivery order if this situation wasn't cleared up soon. She found the receipt for the groceries, then opened the bag that held Chinese food. Where's the receipt? Dinner's on me. She lifted her gaze to meet his eyes, preparing to argue. You can buy next time. Deal! She pulled plates out of the cabinet. You hungry? I could eat. Are you one of those guys who's perpetually hungry, always eating and never gaining weight? He shrugged, digging into a container of beef and broccoli. She'd requested Szechuan shrimp. I've never had to worry about it. Like you, I think. Misty and Summer had their mother's body type, tall and slender, while Crystal had taken after Dad. A little shorter, though not short at 5'7", and much stockier. The only time Misty had ever worried about her weight was when she modeled. Back then, no matter what she did, she never felt thin enough. The best thing about quitting modeling was the ability to enjoy food again. After getting them both drinks, she grabbed some cash out of her wallet and settled at the cafe table in the kitchen, sliding the bills toward him. Thanks for doing this. Tate took the money, then eyed the chopsticks she unwrapped. Any chance you could spare a fork? Laughing, she snatched one from a drawer. Never mastered chopsticks? I could teach you. Others have tried and failed. He stirred his noodles. I can't understand why anybody would choose to eat with those when forks exist. She snagged a bite of spicy noodles and shrimp. I like a challenge. That I don't doubt. He took a forkful of beefy noodles. I love this restaurant. I've never tried their Szechuan. Help yourself. She pushed the box toward him. I won't eat all that. He nudged his box toward her. Only fair. They each sampled the other's food. She preferred her spicy noodles, even if her choice required her to replenish her water halfway through the meal. Are you comfortable here at your sister's? Tate asked. Sure, I have everything I need. Except food, that is. Besides spices and a few odds and ends, her cupboards are bare. Is she coming back? She's trying to decide if she should put this place on the market, rent it long-term, or offer it as a vacation spot. I think a lot depends on what happens with her and Grant. They chatted about nothing important while they ate. Tate finished his meal, then forked a few more bites of hers before carrying both their plates to the sink. She put the leftovers in the fridge. When he'd texted that morning, offering to bring dinner, she'd nearly refused, fearing he'd meant the offer as something romantic. But of course not. Tate would never want to date her. He was powerful and ambitious. She was a worker bee, head down, feet very much on the ground. They might be employed in the same office, but they were worlds apart. Knowing that had made it easy to accept his offer. They were friends, nothing more. Before Friday, she'd barely considered him that, but the weekend had changed how she felt about him. Maybe he was a little too quick to push cases off his desk, but he was protective and kind and considerate. Though she hated to admit it, when she heard his rationale for the decisions he made at work, she understood, even if she didn't always agree. 2 days before, she'd disdained Tate Steele. Now she respected him. More than that, she liked him. I did some digging. Tate nodded toward the living room, and she led the way and settled in the chair where she'd sat the day before. From his backpack, he pulled out his laptop, a pile of papers, and a couple of files. The files he set aside. The laptop went onto the coffee table, but the pile of papers he handed over. Everything I could find out about Thornbrook. She skimmed the paperwork. So the building was built. Completed this summer. It's owned by a company called IAF. What is that? No idea. A Google search turned up a bunch of possibilities, but I haven't had time to figure out which one is associated with that building. Huh. She made a note to dig into that, and then found Raoul Dawson's name. He was lead contractor on the project, and remained so even after the bribery charge, which told her the owners of Thornbrook had okayed, maybe even encouraged, Dawson's bribe. She said as much to Tate. I agree. The guy who turned him in is on there. Zachary. Hardy, got him. I'll call him tomorrow, see what he can tell us. Thing is, Tate sounded pensive when he spoke again. I can't imagine why anybody involved in this case would care enough to bug your apartment. It's a simple case, and the bribe wasn't accepted. The accused will probably claim he was kidding or would never have gone through with it. He shook his head, his lips twisting into a frustrated smirk. I can't figure out why it hasn't been dealt with already. Which tells me it's not simple, she said. There must be a reason. If there is, I don't know what. Tate sat back against the cushions. Though it wasn't a small couch, it seemed dwarfed by his broad shoulders. We'll know more after you talk to Hardy. Meanwhile, we need to settle on a plea deal for that assault. Misty lifted the file in question, skimmed the facts again. The accused had no priors. He was married with 3 kids and gainfully employed. But he'd also been drinking in a bar without his wife. A blood test confirmed he'd been inebriated at the time of the assault. A violent drunk. Or so she assumed. But all accounts said the so-called victim had attacked when the accused had stood up for a woman the victim was bothering. So, maybe not a violent drunk, maybe a noble drunk, who, as Tate had suggested, could take care of himself. Tate didn't speak while she contemplated the case. She wasn't wrong. The accused could be violent, could hurt somebody again. But Tate wasn't wrong either. All the witnesses confirmed that the man had been defending someone else and then defending himself. Had he gone too far? No question. But should he lose everything because he'd been standing up for a woman? Probably not. What do you recommend? She asked. Nothing would have happened if the guy hadn't been attacked. She nodded, saying nothing. Tate seemed to brace himself before he answered. I recommend you knock it down to misdemeanor assault, 1 year suspended, and a $500 fine. She made a note. I concur. His eyes popped wide. You do? I think I was wrong about you. He said nothing, just waited with that same look of shock on his face. You're not always wrong about everything. He laughed and sat back. High praise. I'm honored. She joined his amusement and tossed the file aside. That just leaves the bribery charge. We could drop the charges completely, Tate said. Maybe that'll make your intruder go away. Do you think that'll happen? He looked away. A moment passed before he met her eyes again. Unfortunately, I don't. I don't know if it's related to Thornbrook or something else, but people don't go to that much trouble without a good reason. The question is, what are they after? That's one question. The other is, should we dig into it, or should we let it go? Let the police handle it. What would get you out of danger? Not that I want to be in danger, but if it's an issue of justice, then I'm willing to endure a little danger to reach it. So, I'm not ready to drop that charge yet. Let me talk to Zachary Hardy first, learn what I can, and we'll go from there. His pressed lips said he wanted to argue, but he didn't. One more thing, Leland thinks your intruder might be related to the Kyle Griffin case. He wants us to get that settled as soon as possible. Misty sat back, frustration mixing with the Chinese food in her stomach. The man is dangerous, and he needs to be behind bars. Not that he would be, if she didn't change Tony Castellan's mind. Okay. Tate's tone was too calm, like he was trying to rein her in. She resented it. Tell me about it. Griffin and the victim were dating. When he got abusive, she called the police. He was arrested for assault, but the charges against him were dropped. Why? She shrugged, the movement probably not hiding her anger. He's connected. The prosecutor decided not to pursue it. Who was it? Clinton. Apparently, they didn't teach him how to grow a backbone at Harvard. She drew out the word like their smarmy fellow prosecutor. Did you know his father and Leland were roommates? She laughed. I think the kid at the newsstand knows, and the lady in the coffee shop. Gladys, Tate said. Misty's laugh faded. You know her name? She supplies my coffee and never fails to have my favorite creamer. Of course I know her name. Huh. The woman supplied Misty's coffee too, but Misty had never bothered to ask. Anyway, she said, he's been stalking the victim since then. Melanie has 2 kids, and he's even taken to following them. He approached her daughter once after school, grabbed her arm hard enough to leave a mark, and made some threatening remarks about the victim. The kid's only 7. Melanie is convinced he's eventually going to hurt her, or kill her. She's desperate to see him behind bars. Tate nodded, though the movement was more contemplative than agreement. It's hard to send people to prison for stalking. Melanie's brother was picking the kids up that day, and he witnessed how Kyle grabbed his niece, and apparently had witnessed Griffin's abuse before. So you have a solid witness. Had a solid witness. If she admitted to Tate that Tony was backing out, he'd press her to offer a plea, or drop the case altogether. Melanie's kept great records, Misty said. She has a harassment protection order against him, and she's gotten photographs a number of times when he's violated it. Albeit some of those photos had been taken from behind, as he'd walked away. But Misty thought they could be enough of a likeness to prove Melanie's point. She wasn't malicious, just trying to protect her family. Unfortunately, the jury might not realize that. Maybe we can find a compromise, Tate said. I offered 5 years. He refused. I'm not offering less. 5 years? For stalking? For hurting a child and threatening the child's mother because she ended their relationship. And even that made me sick to my stomach. Their counteroffer? 2 years suspended. So you go back with 3, and then they'll refuse counter, and we'll go back and forth until he gets off scot-free. They think I won't take it to court, that they can just keep holding off until I fold. Well, I'm not going to fold. I owe it to my client. Your client is Suffolk County. Not the county. The human beings who live in the county, in the city of Boston, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. She worked hard to temper the anger in her voice, but knew she failed by the matching frustration in his expression. It doesn't serve the Commonwealth for this thug to be on the street. I'll take my chances in court. Leland wants it settled. He didn't tell me that. If he does, I'll make my case. Anyway, it goes to court Wednesday. And she would win too, as long as the victim's brother made the right decision and testified against Griffin. By the look on Tate's face, that wasn't the answer he was hoping for. But she'd done as much compromising as she intended to do. Some cases were worth fighting for, whether they put her in danger or not.
Chapter 10. Tate had already known Misty could be as tenacious as a terrier, so he wasn't shocked when she dug her heels in about the Griffin case. He was shocked at how her passion affected him. How long had it been since he'd cared as deeply as she did about the victims he was supposed to be protecting? He was focused on doing his job efficiently, but should that be his highest goal? It was his job to do the work Leland tasked him with, and to do it the way Leland wanted it done. But it was also his job to protect the people of Suffolk County. Somehow, in his desire to move up in the DA's office, his true purpose had gotten lost. For him, but not for Misty, who was still glaring in his direction. Even wearing that furious expression, she was beautiful, fierce and determined to do what was right, no matter what the cost. He couldn't have stopped the wave of attraction any more than he could pause the surf. The only shock was that he hadn't seen it before. How attractive she was, not just in face and figure. She was a fighter, maybe not like her sister, who'd carried a gun for a living, but in her heart and spirit. Misty was brave and tough. She was amazing. And this was bad, very bad, because the last thing he needed was for this sudden desire to get in the way of their budding friendship. She needed an ally who wasn't drooling over her. He'd keep the drooling to a minimum. What? Her single word sounded defensive. He shook himself out of his stupor and attempted the smile that worked on most women. I admire your passion. She stood, snatching her water glass, and headed for the kitchen. Sure you do. She tossed the words over her shoulder. He followed with his own empty glass. I'm serious. Let me know if I can help you with the Griffin case. Gather information or... I've got it under control. Though the words were still clipped, she turned at the counter and met his eyes. But thanks for the offer. Are we done for the day? Have the police located Frederick Parks? Not yet. Talked to Reyes earlier, and she assured me they were searching, but there's been no sign of him. Okay then, I brought his file, thought we could skim it, see if we can figure out where he might go. With fresh glasses of water, they returned to the living room, where he found the information they had on Parks. I haven't had a chance to look through it. Misty settled on the couch beside him. She leaned close to read the file he'd opened on his lap. Much as he liked her being close, he slid it to the table so she'd shift away, allowing him to concentrate. Parks's victim, Ernie Phillips, was hospitalized. He barely survived. She flipped through the file until she reached photographs. They were clearly taken in a hospital room. Tate leaned in to get a better look at the man's face. Eyes swollen shut, broken jaw, cast on one arm from shoulder to fingertips. The thought that the man who did that might be after Misty raised bile in his throat. Swallowing, Tate flipped back to the first page and skimmed. Motive? We never knew. Parks was in a gang, but the victim didn't seem to be connected to any illegal activities. He wasn't in law enforcement. He worked for the state, if I remember correctly. She scanned that page, then flipped through the file and tapped the paper. Right here, he was a building inspector. Huh. Tate grabbed the Thornbrook file and flipped through it. That's a coincidence. Wasn't the guy Dawson bribed also a building inspector? I don't think so. Zachary Hardy worked for... She leaned closer to read the information, her arm brushing his. The scent of her, floral and sweet, filled his mind with images that shouldn't be there. This was far too close for colleagues, but jerking away would only make an already awkward position worse. She tapped where she saw the information she'd sought. Planning and development. Tate turned toward her, their faces just inches apart. What do they do exactly? She scooted back on the sofa and turned his direction, putting distance between them. But the sudden tension stretched across the space. Did she feel it? Or was it all coming from his side of the sofa? They oversee zoning and permits in the city, she said. Not the same thing. Not that there was any reason to believe Thornbrook and Parks were related. He tossed the Thornbrook file back on her coffee table. So you don't think the Parks assault was related to the victim's work? I didn't at the time, Misty said, but it was irrelevant because there were enough witnesses to put Parks away without knowing the motive. The victim claimed he had no idea why he was targeted. Parks approached the guy in broad daylight right outside his house, yanked him out of his car, and started beating him. Bystanders filmed it, and his face was clear on the video. Wait, they filmed it, but nobody tried to stop it? It happened after school. All the witnesses were women and kids, so it's good none of them tried to get involved. They'd have just gotten hurt. Someone did call the police, but they didn't show up in time. When Freddie was done, he ran to his car and drove to Boston. The police found him there on, she consulted the file, Aldous Street. Tate located the police report and noted the address where Parks had been arrested. Home of a friend? She grabbed her laptop and typed in the address, then shifted the screen so he could see. She'd put it on satellite mode, which showed nothing but an empty lot surrounded by brownstones. That's weird. Why would he go there? It's possible something's been constructed there since this image was taken. I didn't look into it at the time because it didn't matter to the case. He searched the police report again. The attack happened in Billerica? That's a pretty nice town, right? Certainly not a hotbed of gang violence. He continued to peruse the file, and she read beside him silently. I assume they looked for him at his mother's house, Tate said. Parks had been living with his mom and younger sister when he'd been arrested. That's probably the first place Reyes went. It would have been nice if you'd had a heads up about him getting out of prison. Kofer should have called you before he was released, not after. He had to have known it was happening. Why wouldn't he warn you? I'll ask him if he ever calls me back. Hopefully Reyes will find Parks and bring him in. Find out what's going on. Assuming he's the one who bugged my apartment, I want to know why. Though Misty's words were all business, a look flitted across her expression. More than worry, fear. Considering what Parks had done to his last victim, Tate didn't want the man anywhere near Misty.
Chapter 11. Misty hated working from home. She'd never been very good at making friends, but at least in the office, there was the illusion of companionship. There was activity, a change in scenery, people to smile at as if she belonged. Working from home had made her low-grade loneliness acute. Nobody had been happier when employees had been cleared to work in the office after the pandemic. Now she was alone again, and this time, she didn't have the comfort of her own apartment as she settled at Summer's small kitchen table on Monday morning. Her first call was to Tony Castellan. No answer, again. She left another message, praying he'd call her back. Her second call was to Jeffrey Kofer, Freddie Parks's lawyer. "He's not in." The woman who answered the phone sounded harried and impatient. "This is Misty Lake ADA. I'm returning his call from Friday night. It's imperative that we talk as soon as possible." "I'll pass along the message," the woman said. "That's the best I can do." "Give me his cell number and I'll call him directly." "Sorry, I don't do that." Misty stifled a sigh. "Is he expected in today?" "He was. I'll tell him you called." She took Misty's cell phone number and hung up. Frustrated, Misty tried the local zoning office, where Zachary Hardy worked. She learned that he'd been transferred out of permitting, and the person who answered had no idea where to find him. Fortunately, Misty had a contact in the city's Human Resources Department who was able to find where Hardy was currently employed. Misty called, but he wasn't available. She left a message for him to call her back as soon as possible. So far, she was 0 for 3. Maybe that meant things could only get better. With the stack of files from Friday night, Misty started making calls to defense attorneys and offering deals. She hated to admit it, but having Tate talk through the cases had helped her move more quickly than she would have otherwise. Ever since the kidnapping, she'd been second-guessing her decisions, worried she'd screw up and let the wrong guy back on the street. She'd been struggling to see her cases objectively, but with Tate's help, she'd made decisions on 6 out of 7 cases in the course of a weekend. And she felt good about all the plea deals. Based on the reactions she got from defense attorneys, they felt good about them too. A couple dickered on some of the details, but by lunchtime, she'd managed to settle all 6. Just like that. She finished a salad loaded with grilled chicken. Tired of the cafe table-turned workspace, she needed to get out of the apartment. Checking the guard's schedule, she saw that Hughes was on duty again today. She sent him a text. "Can you check the roof? See if there's any place up there to sit?" His answer came immediately. "There is." "Huh. Thorough, these guards. I'd like to work up there this afternoon. Give us a few minutes to make sure it's clear." 15 minutes later, Misty pushed out of the dark stairwell into the sunny August day and breathed in fresh air. Leaving Hughes by the door, she crossed the rooftop to the little patio area, set her laptop and files on a table, and brushed dust off a wicker chair. It was hot in the sun, but comfortable in the shade beneath the awning. Even better, since she was 5 stories off the ground, many of the typical scents of the city, exhaust and garbage, didn't reach her, and even the sounds were muted up here. She was still breathing in the fresh air when her phone rang. Misty Lake. Hi. This is Zach Hardy. I got a message to call you." "Hi, Mr. Hardy." Misty opened the Thornbrook file. "I'm a prosecutor with the Suffolk County DA's office, and I wanted to talk to you about the bribe offered by Raoul Dawson." The pause that followed her words was unnaturally long. "What do you want to know?" He sounded wary. "What can you tell me?" "Not much to tell. I refused to issue the permits. Dawson offered me a bribe." "How much?" 10 grand. She whistled. "That's a lot of money to turn down." "I believed in what I was doing." Believed, past tense. "Where was the bribe offered?" she asked. "Were you at the property?" "Nah. I didn't need to leave the office to do my job. Dawson found me on my way to my car." "Did he threaten you?" "Not in so many words, but I got the sense he was serious about getting the permits." "And you turned it down because—" "There are rules in place for a reason," Hardy said, "and those rules shouldn't be overlooked because somebody's connected." She'd been about to ask a follow-up question when that last word snagged. "You think Dawson was connected?" "Somebody was, no question." "To—" "I don't know, but after I refused the bribe and turned him in, I was transferred out of that department and given a lousy job with less responsibility. I'd quit and find something else, but I'm counting down to retirement." "Before that happened, were you pressured to issue the permits?" "Nope. My boss seemed impressed I'd turned the money down, even recommended me for a promotion. He was as confused as me when I was transferred." So maybe Dawson was connected. Or, if not Dawson, then somebody at Thornbrook. Tell me why you didn't issue the permits. The property wasn't zoned for what they planned to build. There are plenty of business districts in Boston, but that was a residential area. Look, I could get into all the specifics, send you the zones and stuff. The point is, that building should never have been built on that spot. Would you please send me that information? He sighed. Sure, why not? She gave him her email address. So he offered you a bribe, she prompted, hoping he'd elaborate. Which was stupid. Even if I was dumb enough to take his money, once the building was built, it would be easy to see it didn't belong there. There's not enough parking, not enough frontage area for an office building that size, and it's surrounded by converted brownstones. If anybody had a gripe about it, they'd easily see I'd issued the permit. I could have gotten fired. Or so I thought. Another loaded remark. Explain. Well, the guy who replaced me issued the permits. I assume his bank account reflects it. And the building is there, and nobody seems to care. Makes me feel like an idiot. I turned down the money and lost my job. He took the money, and last I heard, is managing the department. Like I said, somebody over at Thornbrook was connected. You don't think it was Dawson? He was a cog, low man on the pole. Kind of a rough guy, construction worker, you know, just doing what they told him. Who is they? That's the question, isn't it? Indeed it was. Thanks for your help. Send over that information as soon as you can. She ended the call and made notes. Somebody higher up in state government had transferred Hardy and moved a more willing person into his position. Was that person connected to somebody at Thornbrook? Or was it somebody from IAF, the company that had the property built, who had connections with state officials? She made a note to dig into IAF, but first, Thornbrook. She found a number for the construction company and dialed. A woman with a perfect receptionist's voice answered. Thornbrook Construction, how may I help you? Hi there. Misty made her tone as friendly as possible. This is Misty Lake, ADA. Can I speak with Raoul Dawson? Mr. Dawson is off the property at the moment. Can I take a message? Any chance his boss is available? I'd like to speak with someone familiar with the IAF project. 1 moment, please. Misty waited 5 minutes, 6, before an older-sounding man answered the phone with a gruff, Bob Begley. Hi, Mr. Begley. This is Misty Lake with the DA's office. I'm just trying to clear up a few facts about the Raoul Dawson case. Are you familiar with it? You'll need to talk to Mr. Dawson's attorney. Of course, I understand. I was more curious about the building project itself. It was completed, is that correct? Yeah, he said. Not sure why that yahoo at Planning and Development tried to hold up the permits, but they were all issued, no problem. My understanding is that the property didn't align with the codes. Were adjustments made or exceptions sought to get the building built? His voice took on a patronizing note. We aligned with all the codes, ma'am. You ought to drive by it, see for yourself. It's a beaut. We just completed another property for IAF at Hearts and Homes, a rec center. They're having a big grand opening on Sunday. All sorts of bigwigs are coming. The Attorney General's going to be there, even a representative from the governor's office. Maybe the governor himself. I could probably get you an invite. Quite a who's who list. Hearts and Homes. That sounded familiar, but she couldn't figure out why. Where is that property? Hopkinton, a town west of Boston in Middlesex County. You're saying IAF is connected to Hearts and Homes? International Aid something, I think, he said. IAF owns it. They got some kind of housing out there. That's very helpful, thank you. You want that invite? We got more tickets than we can use. She started to reject his offer, but thought better of it. Maybe. Let me get back to you. Misty ended the call and Googled Hearts and Homes. When the first page loaded, she remembered why she'd heard of it before. Hearts and Homes was a community for displaced refugees. It had first opened years prior, hailed as a place where people who'd gone through the worst tragedies imaginable could find rest and peace. As far as she knew, the place offered just that. But a few years back, there'd been a problem with a furnace, a carbon monoxide leak. The alarms had sounded, but one deaf woman, Jamila Amin, hadn't heard them. She'd died in her sleep. The tragedy made the local newspapers. Misty figured there'd been an investigation, but couldn't remember how it turned out, assuming she'd ever known. She made a note to look into it. Maybe none of what she'd learned from Hardy and the guy at Thornbrook mattered, but something told her there was a lot more going on beneath the surface that she hadn't uncovered. Until she knew what it was, she wasn't ready to drop this so-called simple bribery case.
Chapter 12. Tate spent the morning and early afternoon focusing on his own cases, though he found his mind as much on Misty and her dilemma as on the files he needed to close out before the end of the week. He was just hanging up the phone when Clinton stepped into his office. "I need to tell you, your father roomed with Leland at Harvard." Tate pushed back his chair and stood. He'd been in a decent mood. A neutral mood at least, but the sight of his nemesis made his blood heat. "You went golfing with the boss over the weekend. Or was it lunching or country clubbing? Whatever it was, you already told me." Clinton's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose on his forehead. "Someone steal your lunch money? Tell me about Kyle Griffin." He blinked and those brows lowered. "Who?" "He beat up his girlfriend and she wanted to press charges, but you dropped them." "I don't remember that case." "Look it up. He's gone from abuser to abusive stalker, which wouldn't have happened if he'd been behind bars." Clinton nodded, though the movement was slow and deliberate. "Your case?" "Misty's. She's taking it to court Wednesday, but she wouldn't have to if you were competent, Harvard notwithstanding. Tell you what, Steele, you take care of your cases and I'll take care of mine." He swiveled and walked away. Jerk. Tate settled back in his chair and tried to resume his work, but he found it difficult to concentrate. 30 minutes later, his desk phone rang. "Steele here. Why aren't you in my office?" Leland didn't sound happy. Did we have a meeting, sir?" "I told Clinton to send you up almost an hour ago." "He didn't tell me." Tate stood, fresh irritation making his words clipped. "I'm on my way." After climbing the stairs and getting a go-on-in nod from the DA's assistant, Tate knocked on his door and stepped inside. "Sorry about that. Have a seat." Tate settled into one of the two chairs on the opposite side of Leland's wide desk. "What's up?" "How are your cases going?" "No problems." He updated his boss on the work he'd done that morning, though the DA rarely got that involved in day-to-day operations. "And Misty's cases?" "She was planning to offer plea bargains on all but one of them today." "Which one?" "The Dawson case. Bribery charge." Leland leaned against his high-back leather chair. "I thought I told you to take care of that." "It's her case." Defensiveness rose and Tate worked to tamp it down. "She feels like she needs more information." Leland rolled his eyes. "Give me the facts." Tate did, which didn't take long, considering how little they knew. "That's it," he said when Tate was through. "She ought to drop the charges." Tate agreed, but it seemed disloyal to Misty to say so. "I'm sure she'll reach the right conclusion. She's thorough. Which is why I wanted you to help her." He blew out a breath. "Look, Steele, I think you've got what it takes to move up here. Smart, well-educated, ambitious. I know you're ready for a new challenge." Forcing himself not to look too eager, Tate simply nodded. "I am, absolutely. Not that I haven't enjoyed. White-collar crimes aren't what you're used to. Not that they're victimless, but we're not talking about murderers and rapists here. We're usually talking about embezzlers and—" He gestured toward Tate as if his empty hands held stacks of files. "Bribery. I need to know you're the kind of guy who can handle that. The case we're talking about. It doesn't matter if there's more to it or not. It doesn't matter if— What was his name? Dawson. If Dawson was acting on someone else's behalf or working alone. For your purposes, it only matters if he did the crime, if a jury can be convinced he did the crime, and if he should do time or pay a fine for the crime, right?" "Yes, but—" "So why hasn't that case been closed?" "Because it's Misty's case, not mine." "You'd have closed it?" "Absolutely." Even if there was more to it, Tate would have dropped the charges and moved on. He'd never have bothered to figure out if there was a conspiracy, which sitting across from Leland seemed like the right decision. But when he was with Misty, he understood her need to understand the big picture. "And she's not even here." Leland shook his head. "Because of the intruder in her apartment and her concern for her personal safety, She's working from home. She should have decided to do what was asked of her. He exhaled a long breath. Sorry, it's not your problem. Ever since the kidnapping, she's been off her game. She just needs time. Maybe. By the firm press of Leland's lips, he didn't look convinced. I'm just not sure she has what it takes to do this job. I was thinking of moving her into white collar, but maybe she won't be able to manage that either. Misty and white collar crimes. Not Tate, but Misty? She didn't want the position, but if Leland wanted to move her, he would. Leland seemed to be waiting for him to speak. Tate cleared his throat. Sick to his stomach. Tried to think of what to say. Before he had time to, Leland continued. The way her cases piled up, she isn't handling them. You've worked with her. What do you think? Tate's stomach churned. With the right response, he could nudge Misty out of his way. She didn't even want to work in white collar, but Leland didn't think she could hack the ones she was prosecuting. So maybe it wasn't a matter of Misty staying where she was or moving to white collar crimes. Maybe it was a matter of Misty moving or finding a new job. Was that Tate's problem? Leland was watching him through squinted eyes, perhaps aware of the very difficult position he'd put him in. Tate needed to answer honestly, no matter what it meant for him. He spoke with confidence. Misty is competent and capable, and having worked with her this weekend, I find myself admiring her passion. I think she'll be an asset wherever you put her. Even though he'd probably put himself further from his goal, and even though his stomach churned with emptiness and nausea, he'd have felt much, much worse if he hadn't spoken the truth. Leland's expression didn't shift for a long moment, and then he smiled. Was that admiration Tate saw there? Had it been a test? All right then, it's good to know where you stand. Leland stood and held out his hand. I'm serious about that bribery case. Use your influence with her to get her to drop it. She has too many other cases that need to be dealt with. I'll do what I can. Tate was halfway out the door when Leland added, Oh, what about Griffin? Did she offer a plea? Rather than tell the boss what he obviously didn't want to hear, Tate said, You should talk to her about that. I'm not sure where it stands. Which was technically true because something could have changed that day. But mostly Tate didn't want to bear any more responsibility for Misty's bad decisions.
Chapter 13. Misty had been about to finish up for the day when her cell rang, probably her sister. Summer had called to check on her multiple times a day, despite Misty's assurances that she was safe. Honestly, she was surprised Summer hadn't shown up to babysit her. But it wasn't Summer on the line. Recognizing the number as one Misty had dialed that morning, she snatched it up. Misty Lake. It's Tony Castellan. Melanie's brother. His voice was high for a man's, though perhaps only because he was nervous. I know what you're going to say, but I can't testify. You'd sacrifice your sister's safety and that of her children? Why? I have a family too. Have you been threatened? Threatening a witness was a felony. They could put Griffin away for that, if they could get Tony to testify. Kyle was my best friend. Even after he beat up your sister? Misty didn't temper her accusing tone. Started following them around? Injured your niece? Are you really still loyal? No! By the anger in his voice, Misty was getting to him. I'm just saying. His friendship is more important than your sister's safety? Of course not. Then what is? I can't testify. He was breathing hard. You can testify, and I'll be issuing a subpoena to ensure you do. I won't show up. Tell me what's going on. In the long pause that followed her demand, she let herself hope he might be swayed. I didn't see anything, Tony finally said. I don't know anything, and if you call me to testify, that's what I'll say. But I do have something I think'll help. Frustration hummed in her veins. She groped for some way to change his mind, but she'd worked with enough spooked witnesses to know he wasn't waffling. What is it? I started to suspect he was hurting my sister. Once when I showed up at her house, she had a black eye and a bruise on her arm. She denied it, but I knew. Kyle is... He heaved a breath. I'll never forgive myself for hanging out with him, bringing him into our lives, into Melanie's life. It's my fault she got involved with him. He had money, and after that loser boyfriend of hers left her with the kids, and Kyle started showering her with presents. I tried to warn her off him, but the point is, it's my fault. So when I saw the bruises, I knew he was hurting her. I needed to find a way to bring him down. You can bring him down by testifying. Tony continued as if she hadn't spoken. I set up a camera at her house, thinking she could use the recording to get him to back off. Hope and fury mingled in a strange cocktail. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because I have a family too. I didn't realize how he was before. I swear I didn't know what kind of man he is. We grew up together, me and Kyle. I thought we were friends. I didn't want him hanging out with Melanie because he's... Another deep breath. The point is, I got scared, okay? He'd have known either Melanie set up the video camera or I did. He'd have made both of us pay. Your sister's been paying all along. I know. Again, his voice pitched high. I'm trying to figure out how to put him away without putting anybody else I love in danger. What about justice? What about doing the right thing? Tony laughed, the sound humorless. Tell me you're joking. You work in the DA's office. You know justice doesn't exist. She knew no such thing. But how often did victims get justice? Not very. She thought of all the deals she'd made that morning. Had she been an agent of justice or expediency? The question didn't settle well. But she'd done what she could. That was the problem. She could do so little. I need that recording. She wouldn't try to talk him into testifying again right now. She'd let the subpoena do the work for her. Can you bring it by the DA's office? No, I can't go anywhere near there, or near Melanie. I told Kyle she and I aren't speaking. He's got people watching her all the time. They're watching me too. Kyle's got eyes everywhere. Was Kyle Griffin really that powerful? Or had Tony descended into paranoia? What do you suggest then? You gotta meet me somewhere he won't see us. Not at my work, definitely not at yours. Maybe I could leave it for you in the park, and you could pick it up after, like a dead drop, like they do in spy movies. She wasn't about to play 007. A friend of mine owns a coffee shop. I'll get in touch with him and make arrangements for us to meet there. I'll go in through the back door, and you can go in the front and order something. You can pass the recording to the owner, and he can give it to me. Does that work? Tony considered that a long moment before he said, Where is it? She gave him the address. I'll set it up for this evening, okay? Try the cinnamon rolls. They're outstanding. Unlike the charming storefront of Farbad Hashemi's coffee shop, with its pretty green and white awning and wrought iron cafe tables on the sidewalk, the back door was dingy and unremarkable, situated between a dumpster and the white van Mr. Hashemi used to deliver catering orders. The dingy alleyway between the old brick building and the one on the opposite side was wide enough for 2 sedans, but certainly not 2 SUVs, like the one the bodyguard had escorted her to when they'd left Summer's apartment. Ian was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed kid who, aside from the rippling muscles, looked about as dangerous as a golden retriever. He'd backed down the alley, maybe anticipating the need for a quick escape, and parked behind the van. Misty pulled the handle, but the door didn't open. Sit tight, ma'am, Greta said. Let us check it out first. The female bodyguard was older and seemed to be in charge. She hopped out of the passenger seat and knocked on the coffee shop door. It swung open, and the woman stepped inside. Misty and Ian waited in silence for less than a minute before Greta returned to the alley, head swiveling to survey one end to the other. Ian stepped out and opened Misty's door. Straight inside, please. Misty walked between the 2 armed bodyguards, feeling like the Queen of Sheba. Or just feeling like an idiot. All this because somebody had broken into her apartment. But she'd rather be paranoid and silly than cavalier and kidnapped or killed any day of the week. She'd only been in the kitchen of Mr. Hashemi's shop once, back when she'd interviewed him about the man who'd assaulted him. The place hadn't changed. The gleaming surfaces, the scents of yeast and cinnamon and coffee, the stacks of industrial-sized food containers. Mr. Hashemi greeted her without his customary smile. You are all right? He licked his lips, his gaze flicking from one bodyguard to the other. She knew the horror he'd escaped in his own country, understood his well-earned fear of men with guns. She stepped forward, resisting the urge to reach out, to squeeze his arm in reassurance. She didn't know him well enough to touch him. "I'm safe. Thank you for letting us do this. I'm happy to have a way to help you, even if it is only this small thing." "It's no small thing. Has he come yet?" "Not yet." He nodded to a small room off the kitchen. Through the open door, she saw a desk covered with stacks of envelopes and scattered papers. Against the wall, a metal shelving unit held baking pans, bottles of various oils, and huge plastic containers of spices. "Please, make yourselves comfortable." "That's okay. He should be here any minute." Mr. Hashemi nodded, bending at the waist the slightest bit, and headed through the curtain to the front. Aside from a kid washing dishes and Misty and her bodyguards, the back room was empty. Misty leaned against the wall near the door. "Thanks for doing this." "Happy to, ma'am." Ian stood on one side of her. "It's our job." On her opposite side, Greta said nothing. They didn't have to wait long before Mr. Hashemi pushed through the curtain again. He approached and held out a flash drive. "He slipped this to me with the money to pay for his cinnamon roll." "Excellent." She took the flash drive and shoved it in her pocket. "Is he gone?" "Yes, left as soon as he got his food." That was good. The man was probably being paranoid, but if people were following him, they'd be gone by the time Misty and her guards left. "You will be in tomorrow?" Mr. Hashemi asked. "Probably not for a few days. I've been missing your coffee." The old man didn't ask where she was staying or why she'd changed her routine. Ian stepped outside, then returned a moment later. Straight to the car. She followed him into the alley, Greta behind. Ian was halfway to the car door when a gunshot reverberated off the brick walls. Ian gasped, went down. "I'm hit!" Greta pushed Misty forward, around Ian, who was struggling to get up. Misty couldn't leave him. "Get in!" Greta shouted. "Get!" Her words were lost in the sound of more gunshots. Masked men were coming from both ends of the alley. Greta yanked her down, covering her with her body. More gunshots sounded. Then a man shouted, "Misty Lake! We need to—" Another gunshot. In Misty's ear, Greta said, "We'll provide cover. You run back to the coffee shop." Before Misty could respond, Greta rolled off of her, firing. Misty bolted to the back door. It was locked. She banged on it. It whipped open, and she was pulled inside. Mr. Hashemi slammed the door behind her, eyes wide and terrified. "What is happening?" "I don't know. Call 911. "I did. Where are your people?" "Still out there. Ian and Greta, maybe shot, maybe dying." "Why? Who would be shooting at them?" She didn't know. She only knew she needed to get out of that store, now, before anybody else got hurt. "Wait for the police," she said. "If my guards try to get in, let them. Otherwise, lock the doors and don't open them until you see a badge." "I have customers." "Lock them in or kick them out. Just be safe." She bolted through the kitchen and into the cafe filled with diners. They were standing, staring at her wide-eyed. The sound of gunshots was muffled, but clear enough. More people who could be harmed because of her. She couldn't have it. She wouldn't. She ran outside into the warm evening, not stopping to see if anybody followed. She heard footsteps, shouts, though whether they came from friends or enemies, or just surprised bystanders, she didn't know. She ran, flat out, away from the coffee shop and her bodyguards in safety, until she reached a tea station. She rushed down the concrete steps, dodging commuters and tourists, and then hopped over the turnstile. Not that she had time to stop and pay the fare, but even if she did, she didn't have her purse or her wallet. She had nothing but her phone and that little flash drive. She ran again and turned a corner toward the train platform, looking behind her. At the top of the stairs, a man wearing all black met her eyes. He ran down the stairs, pushing people out of his way. A train screeched into the station. She jumped on, watching through the window as the man got closer, closer. He shouted, "I just want to—" But the doors closed. The train pulled away. Misty collapsed into a seat, heart thumping, lungs burning, staring at the furious man on the platform. What had just happened? Chapter 14. Are you out of your mind? Tate's raised voice had Misty's already racing heart picking up speed. Don't yell at me. She clicked on the seatbelt and collapsed. She didn't have the energy to talk, much less argue. I'm not. He took a deep breath and shifted the car into drive. Not until after she'd gotten on the train had she looked to see where she was headed. She'd taken the red line to Park Street, then hopped off, walked the underground corridor to Downtown Crossing, and gotten onto the outbound Orange Line train, hoping to throw off the person, or people, following her. And then she'd called Tate and asked him to meet her at Wellington, a commuter stop almost at the end of the line, not explaining how she'd ended up alone and on the T when she was supposed to be safely tucked in at Summer's apartment. Nice car. It wasn't really. An old, dingy Honda Accord. She'd have pegged him as someone who drove a luxury car. Come to think of it, that summer at the hospital in Maine, she'd seen him climbing into a BMW. Not mine, he said. I was still at the office when you called, and my car's in the apartment garage. I borrowed this. He signaled and turned toward the city. What happened? As she explained, his gaze kept darting toward her, disbelief in his expression. When she was finished, he said, Do you think this witness, Tony Castellan, did you say? Do you think he set you up? She tapped the pocket where she'd left the flash drive. I don't know. Why would anybody shoot at me? She could still hear the sound of her name echoing off the alley's brick walls. She could still hear the gunshots, and see Ian on the ground, and hear Greta telling her to run. At the thought of the people who'd tried to guard her, her stomach roiled. Were they all right? She needed to find out. Her phone had been buzzing for half an hour, but she hadn't wanted to answer it until she was safe. Now she was. She hoped, anyway. She needed to find out if the bodyguards were all right, if anybody else had been hurt. This was a nightmare. It must have been Castellan, Tate said, which tells me all this is about the Griffin case, not Dawson and the bribery, not Parks. Yeah, maybe. His logic probably tracked, but she couldn't think. Maybe? Somebody just... I know what happened, she snapped. She took a breath. Sorry, I'm just... Her whole body trembled. Being shot at, running. Not until she'd been on the Orange Line, not until she'd started to think she'd actually escaped that guy who'd been following her, did the enormity of what happened start to sink in. Even now, she couldn't seem to get her mind to comprehend it. Rather than explain any of that, she simply said, Thank you for picking me up. He nodded, but didn't respond. In the silence, her phone buzzed again. Answer that, he said. She pulled it from her pocket and looked at the screen. Summer. Of course. She connected the call. Hey! Thank God you're all right. The simple words had a profound effect, pulling Misty out of her stupor. A sob climbed up her throat, and she doubled over, holding her stomach. She couldn't speak for the emotion clogging her voice. Misty, Summer said, are you all right? Were you hurt? Ian said, He's okay? Yeah, the bullet hit him in the thigh. He said by the time he figured out what had happened, you were gone. Greta? She wasn't hurt. She laid down cover fire until you got inside. When you did, the shooters took off. She said she expected to find you waiting for her, but you'd taken off. Where are you? I had to get out of there. There were innocent people, Mr. Hashemi, his customers. What if those guys had come in? Greta and Ian would have protected you. Summer sounded like she was fighting anger. They sent you inside to keep you safe. You're supposed to do what they say. For all I knew, they were dead. Misty hadn't meant to shout. Tate reached across the console and laid his hand over hers, squeezing it in a warm, supportive grip. That simple touch calmed her. He would want to hear Summer's end of the conversation. She could either put the phone on speaker or repeat what her sister said when Tate questioned her. She put it on speaker. Tate shot her a grateful smile. Gently, Summer said, Fear can make us do crazy things. Had Misty been propelled out of the coffee shop by fear? She'd thought she was protecting innocent people, but maybe she should have stayed and waited for the bodyguards. At the time, she hadn't thought they'd be able to get to safety. She'd feared their deaths, and her own. Next time, Summer said, please stay put, at least long enough to find out if your bodyguards are all right. I didn't mean for them to get hurt. It's not that I didn't care. I was trying to keep everybody safe. I understand. I don't mean it that way, as if it was your job to check on them. I just mean that, if they're able, they'll find a way to protect you. If you'd waited a minute or two, Greta and Ian would have secured your safety. But if you take off on your own, anything can happen. They've been frantic to find you. Not just them, but the whole team. Now, can you please tell me where you are? I got on the T, changed trains. I had my friend Tate pick me up at Wellington. Okay, so you're with him? In a car, not on the street? Yeah, we're safe. Next time, call me, and I'll send a car. You keep saying next time. Is there going to be? I just mean, if something else happens. Summer's voice was calm, almost placating. You need to stay with the people trying to protect you. Misty swiped at her tears and sat back. She was safe. It was over, for now. I want to go home, or back to your place, I guess. Change into her pajamas, drink a cup of hot tea, and curl up under a blanket. Tate cleared his throat. We need to go to the police. She didn't want to do that, not even a little. Summer said, your friend's right. Greta's there now. I'm going to send you the address of the precinct. Go straight there. I'll let Greta know you're on your way. It was the last thing Misty wanted to do, but someone had been shot. And it wasn't as if she'd been making the best decisions in the last hour, running on fear and adrenaline. Fine then. She'd do what Tate and Summer said. We're on our way.
Chapter 15. Tate followed Misty into the detective's bullpen, a giant room filled with desks, mostly empty at 9 o'clock at night, at the Boston PD headquarters. He'd expected to find Misty dressed in her usual work attire when he picked her up, business suit, high heels, hair in a bun. But she wore jeans, a pretty floral blouse, and slip-on sneakers. Good thing. He couldn't imagine her running through Boston in the heels she wore to work. Detective Reyes, a middle-aged woman with dyed red hair, graying roots, and skin so pale it was almost pasty, led them to a desk not far from the elevator. Have a seat. Misty did, and Tate pulled a chair from an adjacent desk and settled in beside her. She'd been calm, then crying, then angry. He couldn't imagine what she'd endured, not just the bullets aimed at her, but the fact that one of her bodyguards had been shot. Tate couldn't do much, but maybe his presence helped. Misty had called him, after all. When she'd thought her life was in danger, she hadn't called her sister or the police or even an Uber for a ride. She'd called him, and thank God she had. It was astounding how important she'd become to Tate in just a couple of days. Maybe because of all the time they'd spent together, perhaps because she'd now been threatened twice and needed him both times. That was probably all it was, these feelings rising up in him, and they'd be carried away when the autumn breeze blew in. But he didn't think so. Where's Greta? Misty asked. How's Ian? She'd already posed those questions once, the moment Detective Reyes had introduced herself, but the detective hadn't responded, just led them here. Do you know if Ian's all right? Is he in the hospital? Did he? Opening a notebook, Reyes said, Your bodyguards already told me their version of events. Did you see them? Did you go to the hospital? They came here. But Ian, the bullet just grazed his thigh. But he fell! Misty's voice was too loud, and a cop seated a few tables away turned their direction. It must have been worse than that. Tate was tempted to take Misty's hand again, but feared she wouldn't appreciate the gesture at that moment. Reyes's expression shifted to a soft smile. He got down to return fire. He didn't fall. But that... Oh. Misty closed her eyes, shook her head. I thought... He said he was hit. He was, Detective Reyes said. I'm sure it was painful and shocking. It just wasn't that serious. That's good. She took a breath. Thank God. Can you tell me what happened? Misty recounted the events for the detective. adding a few details Tate had missed when she told him. Like how closely the man following her had gotten in the train station. She'd barely outrun a gunman. Thank God he hadn't fired at her in the station. Thank God the train came when it did. "You got a good look at him?" Reyes asked. "Yes, I was on the T and he was on the platform. He looked right at me." "It wasn't—" She consulted her notebook. "Frederick Parks, the man you told me about on Saturday." "No," Misty shook her head. "Definitely not. This guy was older than Freddie and taller." "Okay," Reyes said. "Can you describe him?" Misty closed her eyes. "I'd guess he was in his 40s. Taller than I am, but only a little. Maybe 6 feet. Broad shoulders. Broad all the way down. Like he worked out. And if he quit, he'd be chubby. Thick neck. Big head. Square face. Strong jaw. Really short brown hair. It stuck up on top. It was shorter on the sides. Some gray at the temples. No beard or mustache, but he needed a shave." She opened her eyes. "Does that help?" "Yes, a lot." Reyes flew over her laptop keys. "Have you ever seen Kyle Griffin?" Tate asked. Misty turned to him. "I've never met him in person." To Reyes, Tate said, "That's where I'd start. Today's meeting was about him." "He's a defendant in one of my cases," Misty added. "Were Greta or Ian able to identify anybody?" "There were 2 shooters, but they both wore masks," Reyes said. "You're the only one who saw a face. Tell me why you were there." Tate listened while Misty explained the meeting she'd set up with Tony Castellan. "You have that flash drive?" Reyes asked. After Misty handed it over, Reyes slipped it into the port on her laptop. She clicked the mouse, then spun the screen so they could see. It was a video of one person grabbing another person and shoving her. Tate guessed it was a her, to the floor. But she fell out of view of the camera. The video had been taken in a living room, but it was grainy, hard to make out. Worse than that, neither of the people's faces were visible on the screen. "Is there sound?" Reyes tapped her volume button, but nothing changed. "Doesn't look like it." Misty sighed and sat back. "That's useless. What does Tony think I can do with that?" Tate suspected the man knew the video wouldn't help Misty's case. There was only one reason he'd go to the trouble to get it to her. "Castellan set you up." "Maybe." Misty looked from him to the detective. "Maybe he's trying to help. He thought Griffin's men were following him. Maybe they followed him there and saw you go in through the back?" Tate's frustration rose. Obviously, this Tony Castellan guy didn't care about his sister. "And they just happened to be prepared to ambush you? How long were you in the coffee shop?" She shrugged. 15, 20 minutes. Reyes flipped through her notebook. 22, according to Greta. Not long enough for Griffin to set up an ambush, right? Tate looked from Misty to Reyes and back. "Do you disagree?" "I just hate to think." Misty rubbed her temples. "The victims are his sister and niece. What kind of person would betray his own sister? Griffin must have threatened Tony's family." "Okay," Reyes made a note. "We'll bring him in and question him. Meanwhile, you have someplace to stay?" "I've been staying at my sister's since the break-in on Saturday." "You're keeping that quiet?" "Trying to." Misty turned toward Tate, looking like she was ready to collapse. "We were hoping to throw the intruders off. Remember, they planted a bug, right?" Reyes nodded and he continued. "We went into the apartment and talked about how Misty was going to go stay with a friend in the Berkshires. But they know now that I'm in town. Griffin does anyway." Misty sounded as tired as she looked. "I never should have taken that meeting. It was stupid. I thought that could help." She gestured toward the laptop. "But it's useless." "Griffin and his people don't know where you're staying, right?" Reyes asked. "Right," Misty said. "But why would Griffin bug your apartment?" Tate asked. "What did he hope to gain?" "I guess he wanted to know what kind of plea deal I was planning to offer. Or maybe if I was going to take it to court. Don't you think?" "Why, though? It's not like it's top secret. You'd offer the plea to his lawyer would tell him. Or you wouldn't, which would show you were going to take it to court. What's the big secret?" "I don't know." Across the desk, Reyes was watching, listening. "What do you think?" Tate asked. "I think we need to bring him in and ask him." She stood and Misty and Tate did the same. "Meanwhile, go home or wherever you're staying, keep your bodyguards close. I'll call you when I put together a lineup." When Reyes stuck out her hand, Misty shook it, and then Tate did the same. I need that flash drive back. Reyes's gaze flicked to the computer. Sorry, it's evidence. Misty seemed ready to argue, but then her shoulders drooped. Not that it matters. It's useless. Maybe the case will be irrelevant, Reyes said. If we can prove Griffin and his men ambushed you, we'll put him away for that. Eventually. But meanwhile, the man would be free to terrorize his former girlfriend and her children unless Misty could stop him. And he'd be a threat to Misty. And that assumed they could prove Griffin had been behind today's attack. Tate walked beside Misty out of the bullpen. As soon as they left the large room, two men moved to walk beside her, shifting Tate out of the way. He recognized Hughes. The other bodyguard was new, taller and larger than his partner. Seemed they'd brought in the big guns now. Neither man looked happy as they escorted her out of the building, effectively ignoring Tate as he trailed them. They got to the ground floor and were about to step outside when Misty stopped and turned to him. I guess I'll call you tomorrow. Tonight, when you're home safely, so I won't worry. Her lips tipped up on one side, almost a smile. Okay. She reached out, laid her long, slender hand on his wrist. Her skin was pale and clear, so different from his tan forearm. She squeezed gently. Thank you for coming for me today. Dark circles rimmed her light blue irises. The whites of her eyes were bloodshot, evidence of her fatigue and tears. And for staying with me, it's good to have a friend. Anytime. Her hand slid away, and Hughes and his partner ushered her out the door to the waiting SUV. Tate watched until they'd driven out of sight, thinking of her last words. She'd called him friend. A week before, she wouldn't have named him even that, nor he her. But now he was thinking of her as much more than a friend. He hoped eventually she'd see him as more too. Of course, nothing could happen between them until this was over and she was safe, assuming she ever was.
Chapter 16. On the way back to the police station the following morning, Misty asked her latest bodyguards the questions that had plagued her all night. Ian's all right? You're sure? The one in the driver's seat ignored her, but the other one said, He's fine, ma'am. The guard had introduced himself as Marcus. The bullet just grazed him. But he yelled that he was hit. He was hit. I'm sure it hurt a lot. Marcus shifted tack, though she could guess the word he'd been about to use. When it was over, he was more worried about you than his injury. The guard turned and met her eyes with an intense look. Anything like that happens again, you stay with us. Don't run away again. Greta told me to go inside. Did she tell you to take off? Misty didn't bother to answer that. Summer already lectured me. The man nodded and faced forward again. But did they tell you what happened? Misty pressed. From their perspective? Because it all went down so fast, and I think maybe I saw it differently than they did. She should have asked Hughes the night before, but he'd been all business, and she'd been so tired that she hadn't bothered trying to get any information out of him. We don't think they were shooting to kill, Marcus said. They were trying to keep you pinned down, shooting at the SUV, or over your heads. One of the bullets ricocheted off the ground and hit Ian. If they weren't trying to kill us, then to what end? Greta said one of them called your name. Do you remember that? As if she'd ever forget. I do. Her theory is that the person just wanted to tell you something, and obviously to scare you. But then Ian was hit, and our guys returned fire, and you ran. It didn't go down the way they planned it. He never got to deliver his message. Misty wished he had. It would be very helpful to know what Griffin, or whoever it had been, wanted from her. At the police station, Misty was shown a number of photographs, one at a time, and asked if any of them looked like the person who'd followed her into the T-station. The first few photos, though they matched the general description she'd given Reyes, were definitely not the guy. But the fifth man, that's him. How sure are you? Reyes asked. She stared at the image on the table. He was younger in the photo, not quite as thick all around as the man who'd glared at her through the train window, but there was no question it was the same person. I'm positive. Okay, good. Was that the guy? Reyes smiled. I think you know I can't say. Right. It was very different. being the victim instead of the prosecutor. She'd played the role more than once in her life, and she didn't like it. I should have more information for you soon. Reyes walked her back to the lobby. Do you have someone in custody? We'll do interviews today. I'll let you know what I learn. Meanwhile, the detective quirked an eyebrow, a jaunty, light-hearted look that surprised Misty. Stay out of trouble. Misty's bark of laughter wasn't amused. Would you believe me if I said I'm trying? Reyes was chuckling as she walked away. Back at Summer's apartment, Misty settled at the kitchen table to work. She'd already been behind, and everything that had happened since Saturday had only distracted her from her caseload. The video that had caused so much trouble wouldn't help her put Griffin away. Without Tony's testimony, Misty saw no avenue to conviction. Which meant, unless Reyes could prove Griffin had been behind the ambush the night before, he was probably going to go free. Melanie would still be in danger. Griffin would win. She wasn't ready to concede that, not yet. She called Tate. Everything okay? She'd let him know the night before that she was home safely, but they hadn't talked for long. I made an ID this morning. Don't know who the guy was, and I've been resisting the urge to look up Kyle Griffin's photograph. I'm trusting Reyes will figure it out. You slept all right? If you consider tossing and turning and churning over all the stupid decisions I made all right, then yeah. You didn't do anything stupid. Tate's tone was kind. You were scared, and you ran. Scared people run. I could have gotten myself killed. The words sent a fresh wave of fear over her, and she suppressed a shudder. You were trying very hard not to get anybody else killed. That's noble. Noble, stupid. Apparently it's a fine line. I read the whole situation wrong. Ian was hit, but he wasn't badly hurt. They said he was shooting back. I didn't even see that. I thought he was dead or dying. She hadn't noticed the lack of blood. Panic had blinded her. Anyway, I need to get a continuance on the Griffin case. Would you mind filing it for me? I don't have it in me to go to the courthouse today. Sure. I'm hoping, considering the defendant may have tried to threaten me, not to mention ambushing me and my bodyguards, the judge will agree that delaying the trial is not only acceptable, but necessary. The police need time to investigate, but if it wasn't Griffin, my gut tells me it was. Not that her gut could be trusted, not after her foolish choices the night before. We need to know for sure before it goes to trial. The only thing is, don't tell me Leland wants me to offer a plea, or drop the charges altogether, or, gosh, why don't we just make the guy immune from all prosecution for all time? In fact, let's do that with all the criminals. That'll clear out the courts and the jails. We can all stand around in a circle, prosecutors, defense attorneys, victims, and criminals. Hold hands and sing Kumbaya. There was a long pause after her diatribe. Are you finished? By Tate's tone, he was amused. She should really learn to keep her frustrations to herself. Sorry. I was going to say that Leland wants the guy taken off the streets, sooner rather than later. Oh. You should have heard him this morning when I told him what happened. I've never seen him so livid. His face got all red. He called Reyes himself, demanding to be kept informed. So, no, he doesn't want you to offer a plea deal. He wants you safe. He was going into a meeting, but I wouldn't be surprised if he calls you himself. Huh. Okay, so Leland wasn't a jerk. He cared about his prosecutors. Maybe he even cared about justice. I'll draw up this motion and run by the courthouse now, Tate said. I've got a crazy day today and a late court appearance. But assuming we get a continuance on the Griffin case, dinner tomorrow, I'll pick something up. I'd like that. She was sorry she wouldn't see him until then. Silly, considering this would be the first day she hadn't seen him since this whole thing began. Even sillier when she realized that, actually, she'd seen Tate every weekday for months at work, and she'd hardly given him a second thought, unless it was about what a lousy prosecutor he was. She wasn't used to getting so many things wrong. When she hung up, she felt considerably lighter. Her boss knew what had happened and wanted to protect her. That thought encouraged her, no question. But it was the prospect of dinner with Tate that warmed her heart, because they'd dispensed with most of the cases they'd been tasked to do together, but their friendship continued. Maybe. Maybe it could be more than friendship. Did she want that? She'd been alone for a long time. Like her older sister, she'd eschewed relationships with men. Their father had shown her how dangerous men could be. Misty'd never met one she cared enough about to get past the first few dates. She'd never met one she'd considered worth the risk. She didn't want to be alone forever. Summer had Grant now. Misty's tough-as-nail sister had finally opened her heart. If Summer could do it, Misty could too. But could Tate really be trusted? Maybe, eventually. Right now, she needed to focus on making sure Griffin landed behind bars, and figure out why he had bugged her apartment. Or, if he hadn't, figure out who had. Misty worked to get caught up on her cases the rest of the day, Tuesday, and all day, Wednesday. Fortunately, after Reyes confirmed that the man who'd followed her into the tea station was indeed Kyle Griffin, the judge had agreed that the ambush at the coffee shop needed to be fully investigated before the Griffin case could go to trial. God willing, between the stalking accusation and evidence that he'd attacked her and her bodyguards, the man would end up behind bars. It was after 2 on Wednesday when Tate buzzed the apartment. She clicked the button to allow him access to the building, then, at his knock, opened the door to see him wearing a sheepish smile. "Sorry about this." Misty had been looking forward to their dinner. She hadn't expected to have Tate's assistance on any more of her cases. Unfortunately, Leland had called her and offered to lend Tate's help once again. She'd tried to argue that she didn't need it, but Leland hadn't been swayed. Between the kidnapping, the break-in, and what happened at the coffee shop, Leland had said, "You've got enough on your plate. Just let him help you clear some of it off." At least it was an excuse to spend more time with Tate. "Come on in." She moved aside, and Tate stepped into the living room, then set his laptop bag on the coffee table. "When I offered to bring dinner, I didn't know Leland would have us working together again." "It's fine." At least Leland had called her himself to find out how she was and see what he could do to help. And Tate was easy to spend time with, even when they were arguing. Misty didn't feel the defensiveness or irritation this time. Tate was good at closing cases. As long as Misty ensured that the victims received justice, she'd be happy for the help. She heard her thoughts and chuckled to herself as she headed for the kitchen. Look at her, growing as a person. Accepting help like a mature adult. Summer would be proud. "Something to drink?" she asked. "A soda, if you have one." She returned a few moments later, an open can for her, a glass with ice filled with soda for him, and settled on the couch. "Any updates from Reyes?" he asked. "Not since she confirmed that Griffin was the guy who followed me into the tea station. She promised to call me soon." She made air quotes around the word. Though I think her definition of that might be different from mine. Tate had chosen one of the chairs rather than the sofa this time. He was already leaning over his laptop. "You know, victims think the same thing about us. They can't imagine that we have other things to do besides keeping them informed." Misty set the drinks down and sat on the sofa. "I guess I should cut her some slack." He looked up and smiled. "Rarely a bad idea." He nodded to the stack of files she'd set on the coffee table earlier. "Ready to get started?" They discussed, argued, discussed, and ultimately agreed on a few more of her cases she'd been wrestling with. Not because they were complex, but because the accused were violent and needed to be taken off the streets for as long as possible. Tate helped her walk through the evidence, figure out what she'd be able to prove and what she wouldn't, and come up with plea deals. After a couple of hours of work, she sat back and glared at the files they'd set aside. They're not getting what they deserve. Tate, who'd been responding to an email, looked up at that. "You can only do what you can do. Besides, aren't you glad you don't always get what you deserve?" "That's the thing I'm learning right now about God, I guess. That he doesn't give us what we deserve. He's merciful." She sighed. "Mercy is not my strong suit." Tate's smile spread slowly. "As a prosecutor, mercy isn't your job. We're not paid to be merciful. We're paid to seek justice." "Exactly. That I'm well suited to." "Yes, and that's a gift, your desire for justice. It's just, for me, when I'm offering deals, I like to think there's a little mercy there, a little, let's see if you can do better next time, encouragement. Maybe it makes me feel better about not always pushing for maximum sentences. Do you think it works? Do you think people do better? Because in Misty's experience, people didn't change, or if they did, they descended into worse versions of themselves rather than rising to better versions. That wasn't fair, though. There were plenty of criminals who'd gotten in trouble, gotten caught, and then straightened up. Tate stared at the wall above Summer's small television set for a long, stretched-out moment. She saw something on his face she hadn't seen before. Uncertainty? I guess it's up to them what they do with it. The worry faded, and that little smile returned. Maybe that's what God thinks too. He gives us mercy, knowing most of the time we're going to screw up again. He smiled and shook his head. Not that I'm comparing myself to God. In college and law school, and now at the DA's office, Misty had been surrounded by atheists and agnostics, people who were pretty sure they were the smartest beings in the universe. She'd felt the same at one time, but life had proved to her, over and over, that she wasn't the smartest, and she certainly wasn't the most powerful. She'd come to realize that there was a God, and she was definitely not him. "Are you a Christian?" she asked. "I mean, I know you prayed last week, but lots of people pray." "I am," he said. "Have been since I was a kid. My faith has wavered a couple times over the years, but I've always known who I am. My dad used to say, we're just sinners saved by grace. I'm learning to see myself not as a sinner, but as a saint who sometimes sins. I think that's how God sees us anyway." "Is it?" she asked. "I'm new to it. My mom was a Christian, but it was hard to follow in her faith." Tate closed his laptop and slid it away. "Why?" Misty rarely talked about her parents, about the house she'd grown up in. But she wanted to tell Tate. She wanted him to know her. Maybe, if she learned to trust him, and he her, there could be something between them. "My father was an alcoholic," she said. "A nasty drunk. He was abusive to Mom, and my oldest sister, Crystal. The one time he hurt Summer, she told my uncle, who called the police. Summer's always been tough, never one to take anything from anyone. Dad left her alone, and most of our childhood, she managed to protect me as well." "Most of it. But Summer couldn't be there all the time." Tate leaned toward her. "I can't imagine growing up surrounded by that kind of violence." "It wasn't always bad. There were moments of—" She'd almost said peace, but that wasn't the right word. It wasn't peace if you knew war could break out at any moment. Those moments were just brief and fragile ceasefires. The point is, it was hard to follow in Mom's footsteps of faith when she was the victim of Dad's rage all the time, and she did nothing to stop it, to protect herself, or us. She heard the bitterness in her voice and worked to hide it. "She always took us to church. Dad never went. One Sunday, the pastor was talking about marriage, how it was sacred. He talked about how marriage was a representation of Christ and the church. And I remember thinking, this is why she won't leave. Because God doesn't want her to. If there really is a God, why would he want her to suffer?" He didn't. Tate reached out, settled his hand on Misty's. The gesture was warm and gentle, and so different from what she expected from any man. It felt awkward, allowing a coworker to hold her hand, even a friend. Yet she didn't pull away. "You know that, right?" Tate asked. "He wouldn't have expected or wanted your mother to stay in that situation." "I know, but what was the right thing to do? Should she have left him, sent him to prison? What does the Bible say about all that?" "I'm no biblical scholar. I can't give you a definitive answer." He squeezed her hand and then let go, leaving her feeling unmoored somehow. "I do know that God didn't want you to live like that. Have you ever asked your mom why she didn't leave?" Misty settled back on the couch, wishing she could move closer to Tate. His presence was calming. At that moment, he'd touched her. He'd felt like home. Now, she felt chilly in the air conditioning. Alone. "Mom died when I was in high school. Technically, cancer killed her. But I always blamed Dad. She had nothing to live for." She had you and your sisters. That was true. But Mom hadn't fought for them. She'd loved them, and she'd loved their dad. She was good at love. Assuming love was weak, but was it? Misty stood, uncomfortable with the question she'd posed. How could she doubt her mother's love? But how could she not? Sorry. She looked down at Tate, who was watching her with that intense expression he used when he was trying to figure something out. That conversation turned ugly fast. I didn't mean... She grabbed their empty drinks and headed for the kitchen. She heard Tate behind her, but didn't turn to look at him. She needed to shake off the pitiful memories. Your childhood, your dad's abuse. It explains your desire to see violent people put away. She rinsed her can and tossed it in the recycle bin, then rinsed his glass. More soda? I don't need anything. She fixed herself a glass of water, mostly to give herself someplace else to focus. Why had she told him all that? She felt raw and exposed, embarrassed. It's noble, your desire to protect the weak. He leaned a shoulder against the door jamb. Somebody should have protected you. Mom never told anybody what was happening. That was on her. Definitely not what God would have wanted. He desires truth, even if it's painful and hard. Misty turned to him. She wasn't sure what to say about that. Maybe your mom didn't understand that. Or maybe she was just scared of your father. Or maybe of trying to make it on her own. Or maybe... He shrugged. I can't begin to understand. I'm just saying, you can't blame God for her decisions, any more than you can blame him for mine, or yours, or anybody else's. Even those of us who love God and want to please him mess up sometimes. We misunderstand. We make assumptions that aren't true. We just don't get it right. Which brings us back to mercy. Tate smiled. I love it when a conversation comes full circle, like there was a plan we didn't know we were following. Misty turned away, surprised by the tears stinging her eyes. Because she'd never understood how Mom could have loved the Lord and gotten it all so wrong, or why God hadn't protected them. But Mom, Dad, Misty, and her sisters, they were all just people. And even when they followed God, even when they tried really hard to do the right thing, people messed up. Tate had put into words something she'd been wrestling with. Misty might never figure out what had motivated her mother to stay with Dad. Was it fear? Was it devotion or loyalty or love? She'd never be able to ask, not in this life anyway. But in heaven, perhaps she'd understand. Maybe that could be enough for now. When she turned around again, Tate had gone back to the living room. Had he seen the emotion on her face, known she needed a moment to pull herself together? She swiped her tears with a paper towel, took a steadying breath, and joined him. He looked up from the file he was skimming. It's nearly 5 o'clock. Should we call it a day, order some dinner? Though Misty almost never quit working before 5:30 or 6, she was ready to be finished. What did you have in mind?
Chapter 17. Tate tapped their dinner order in at the restaurant's website, still processing all Misty had told him. No wonder she was adamant about sending violent criminals to jail. It sounded like her dad belonged there. But how could justice be done when the victims didn't tell the truth? He'd never understand why a woman would cover for a man who hurt her. In his job, he'd seen it over and over. Misty's mother, whatever her motivations, should have protected her daughters. She should have told the truth about their dad. Maybe he could have gotten help, gone to rehab, quit drinking, learned to manage his anger. By doing nothing, Misty's mother had only allowed the problem to persist. She hadn't done herself, her daughters, or even her husband any good. But it was easy for Tate to judge, sitting on the outside. It wasn't his family. It wasn't his life. It wasn't his pain. He scrolled down the online menu. Fries or tater tots? He'd suggested they order sushi, figuring she'd appreciate a fancy meal, even though he wasn't a huge fan. But she'd requested burgers. He'd never turned down a good cheeseburger. Tater tots. A woman after his own heart, in more ways than one. I'm buying. She held out her credit card. He laughed. Not a chance. I invited you to dinner. We agreed I'd get the next one. The next time we have lunch, you can buy. Tate, just take. Misty's phone rang. She dropped her credit card beside his laptop and snatched her cell. Misty Lake. She listened, then said, "One moment, detective. I'm going to put you on speaker." She did, setting the phone on the table. "I'm here with Tate." Detective Reyes said, "We located Griffin and brought him in for questioning. He admitted having seen you at the tea station and trying to talk to you, but he denied having anything to do with the shooting at the coffee shop." "He's obviously lying," Tate said. Misty gave him a look. Brows lifted, chin lowered, which he read as "stop talking." "Sorry," he whispered. She smiled, clearly not holding a grudge, and returned her focus to the phone. "How does he explain that, considering we've never met in person?" "Said he'd seen your photo somewhere." Reyes's voice was clipped, all business. "Your friend's right, he was lying. As soon as we locate the shooters, we'll bring them in and, hopefully, get them to finger Griffin as the one who put them up to it." "Are you close to finding them?" Misty asked. "One witness got a license plate number for the car they were driving. We just have to locate its owner. He's slippery, but we'll get him. I've got guys with connections down there." "Where is down there?" Tate asked, shooting a look at Misty, worried she'd be annoyed again. But her focus was on the phone. "The owner of the car lives in Quincy, and Griffin does too." "Quite a coincidence." "Hardly," Reyes said. "Griffin was behind the ambush at the coffee shop. We just got to prove it." "Meanwhile, has he been charged?" Misty asked. "Not until we have hard evidence." "About the break-in at your place." "I assume he denied that too," Misty said. "He did. The thing is, as much as I knew he was lying when he said he didn't plan the ambush, when he denied knowledge about the break-in, I think he was telling the truth. He said he had nothing to do with it, that he hadn't known anybody had broken into your place. He seemed genuinely shocked." "Of course he wouldn't want to admit it." Misty pushed to her feet. "Of course he'd say that." Tate looked from her to the phone. "Why do you believe him, detective?" "It's my job to read people. We were in that interview a long time. He told me the truth about a bunch of things, like having seen you, Misty, in the tea station. He lied about other things, like the ambush. I can read tones, body language. I'm telling you, he didn't break into your apartment." Misty sat again, looking defeated. Reyes continued. "Also, he doesn't match the person in the video on the elevator. Griffin is taller and broader than the person who broke into your place. It could have been someone working for him. Could have been, but it wasn't." Tate admired the detective's confidence in her skills. He just didn't know if that confidence was warranted. "But if it wasn't him," Misty asked, "then who was it?" "My money's on Frederick Parks," Reyes said. "We still haven't been able to locate him, despite having reached out to his family and known associates. The guy's avoiding us, and there must be a reason. I'm guessing. But why would he bug my apartment? It doesn't make sense." "I'll ask him when I find him." "If you find him," Misty muttered. He didn't blame her for feeling discouraged. "Detective, what did you learn about the security system at our building and the fact that the intruder had her code?" "Nothing," Reyes said. "We still have no idea how he got into your apartment." "That's comforting," Tate said. Misty shot him a sardonic smile, leaning closer to the phone. "Is there anything else you can tell us at this point?" "I don't think so. When we get Parks in custody, I'll let you know. Meanwhile, keep out of trouble." "I always do," Misty said. Reyes was laughing when she hung up, though Tate didn't think any of it was funny. He leaned back in his chair, frustrated. "Basically, we don't know anything more than we did before her call. We know where the investigation stands. These things are never as simple as they look on TV." Misty nodded to his laptop. "Did you get our dinner ordered?" He pulled his laptop onto his lap, did one final check of the order, and submitted it. "It'll be delivered in 30 minutes. He held out her credit card. "And it's on me. I don't let my dates pay." "This is a date, then?" He held her eye contact, not surprised by the question. They had eaten together before, as colleagues. Rather than slither out of it or blow it off, he said, "That was my plan when I asked you, yes." He waited for her to tell him she didn't date colleagues or didn't think he was her type, or she'd prefer to spend the rest of her life surrounded by cats, thank you very much. "Okay then." She slid her credit card back into her wallet and returned to the kitchen. He followed, watching as she took out plates. She was headed for the table when he stepped in the way and held out his hand. Let me help. She started to, then pulled them back. Actually, do you want to eat on the roof? There's a nice little area up there, and I'm going stir-crazy stuck in this apartment. He agreed. She told the guard they'd be on the roof and that dinner was being delivered. A few minutes later, they settled on wicker furniture beneath an awning that shielded them from the early evening sun. The still air was warm, upper 80s, he guessed, but much of the morning's humidity had burned off. A few potted trees were scattered around the area, one of which gave off an unexpectedly sweet scent in the middle of the city. Even on the top of the building, the view didn't compare to his, but it was nice enough, overlooking the pretty Back Bay neighborhood. This is pleasant. This is the first time I've been out since I got back from the police station yesterday. It's one thing to be trapped in your own apartment, but being trapped in someone else's is the pits. I can imagine. If Reyes is right and Griffin didn't break into my apartment, then who did? You don't think it was Parks? I don't. Parks had no reason to listen in on my conversations. I still think it must have something to do with the cases I was assigned last week. If not for the listening device, Tate said, I'd agree with Reyes about Parks. But from what I've read about him, he's a low-level thug. Where would he get listening devices or learn how to plant them? And why? If he was out to get you, that's not how he would do it. She tilted her head to the side. You researched him? Sure, I mean, the guy might be after you. I wanted to learn everything I could. Though Misty didn't say anything, her expression softened to one of, was that affection? She sat back, crossing her ankles, a picture of calm that belied their conversation. Freddie threatened me after he was convicted, but last year he asked me to come visit him, said he needed to tell me something. When I got time to go out to Walpole, he refused to see me. The guards couldn't explain it. They did tell me that he'd become a model prisoner, docile even. A few weeks later, he sent me a note thanking me for coming and apologizing for his threats and for refusing my visit. He didn't explain it, but he seemed sincere. So, yeah, the timing looks bad, him getting out of prison right before my place was broken into. But I don't think the break-in has anything to do with Parks. It was possible the guy had become angry again. Maybe he had mental health problems, swinging from docility to anger and back. But that still didn't explain the listening device. I wish it was Parks, Tate said. It would be easier to fight a single person, even a really scary one like Freddie Parks, than an unknown entity. A person, many people. Who knows? At least Freddie is a known quantity. Their dinners were delivered by the grumpy-looking guard, and they dug in, eating directly out of the styrofoam boxes. Warm, salty goodness. His kind of grub. They ate for a few minutes in silence, but the mystery wouldn't leave him alone. If not Parks, then who? I've been digging into the Thornbrook case. Misty wiped her fingers on a napkin and set it aside. Even eating a messy burger covered in barbecue sauce, she managed to be tidy and put together. I called Zachary Hardy a couple of days ago. She explained that the permit office employee, after reporting the attempted bribe, had been transferred out of his department into a job he hated. His replacement had issued the permits, and the building had been built. He thinks someone, Dawson, Thornbrook, or the company that built the building, is connected to someone high up in city or county government. Except, if that were the case, if it's Dawson anyway, wouldn't the bribery charges already have been dropped? She shrugged. You'd think so. Maybe the connection doesn't know or care about Dawson. Maybe the connection doesn't want to get involved. Dawson seems like a pretty small cog. A small cog with a big-time lawyer. There's that. Misty dipped a tater tot in ranch dressing and popped it in her mouth. The building is owned by who again? IAF, International Aid Foundation. They own that and another property out in Hopkinton. Hearts and Homes, a community for refugees. Where that woman died. He remembered a story he'd read about the carbon monoxide leak. What good was an alarm to a profoundly deaf person? All that family did to escape war, all they had to endure to get here, and then she was killed by an odorless gas. Tragic. Yeah, it's the Boston property that Hardy was talking about, though. He suggested that anybody driving by would understand that it shouldn't be there. Why? Misty swallowed a bite of burger, shrugging. He didn't say, just said it would be obvious. Maybe we need to take a field trip. You think your security guards would mind? Smiling, she glanced at the scowling man who had his back to the metal door. They said I could go anywhere I wanted, as long as they stayed with me. Let's do it.
Chapter 18. Misty settled beside Tate in the back seat of the bodyguard's SUV and watched the city roll by. The sun was sinking, the evening air cooling. Twilight had always been her favorite time of day, when the world was tucking in for the night. Children climbing down from their tree houses and running home, preparing for baths and bed. Couples walking hand in hand, dogs testing the limits of their leashes. Back in the little town where she'd grown up, fireflies would be flashing in the bushes. The scent of grilling meat would compete with those of lilies and freshly mown grass. Twilight in Boston was very different. There were few children around, and the adults on the sidewalks weren't out for leisurely strolls, but rushing, always rushing. Sometimes, despite how difficult her childhood had been, Misty missed the quieter suburban life. Her sister must have too, though Coventry was too far away from any city to be considered a suburb. Before long, Summer would be countrified. She'd probably start churning her own butter and spinning her own yarn. "Something funny?" Tate asked. She didn't bother to hide her smile. "Just thinking about my sister living in the country." "You prefer the city, I guess." "I thought I would. I liked living in New York with Summer, and in Boston before that. But, honestly, Coventry's a beautiful little town. I mean, everywhere you look is like a postcard, and the people all know each other, and like each other, and help each other out. It's so different from here, where you can walk by the same people day after day and never know their names." "You can know their names if you ask," Tate said. What did it say about her that it had never occurred to her to try? "I think you're better at that than I am. Better at making friends. Better at being a friend. When I was a kid, we learned to keep to ourselves, to hide the truth. I felt like I couldn't get close to anybody because something might slip. I might accidentally say too much about my father, about our home. There was always this fear of being known, of being found out. Talk about oversharing." She looked away. "I always say too much when I'm with you. Why is that?" She'd meant the question to be rhetorical, but Tate hummed. "Maybe because you know you can trust me." He took her hand and tugged until she faced him again. "I hope that's why, anyway. Because you can." She wasn't sure what to say to that, so she just settled in for the ride. After a few moments, Tate chuckled. "Riding in the back seat reminds me of being a kid." He slouched down, taking up far more space than necessary. "Come on, let's be kids for a minute. You gotta make yourself comfortable. You know how kids are, flopping all over the place. Not uptight and focused like adults, totally relaxed." "But we are adults." Misty tried to sound stern, but she didn't quite manage it. "Didn't you ever play make-believe? Come on, play with me." She slouched, stretching her long legs until they bumped against the seat in front of her. The bodyguard didn't react, though he had to have felt it. She whispered to Tate, "You're weird." "Maybe." His voice was tinged with humor as he slouched closer, his arm resting against hers. They stayed like that, skin touching skin. Innocent, but his body heat warmed her, along with his playfulness, his joy. "Or," he said, "maybe it was all a ploy to get you closer." "Diabolical." "Mwah-ha-ha." He made the laugh sound evil. Giggling, she turned toward him, finding him already facing her way. His breath brushed across her cheek, tickled the hair at her temple. Something decidedly not funny or childish washed over her. He shifted, leaned in. Any second, he was going to kiss her. She wanted him to. She didn't care about the bodyguards in the front seat, or the fact that he was her co-worker, or any of it. All she cared about in that moment was how much she wanted to feel his lips against hers. But the SUV came to a stop. "This is the place," the bodyguard said. She started to shift away, but Tate gripped her arm, leaned in, whispered, "We'll finish this later." And then, he slid away and pulled the handle. So cool, so confident. She cracked up when his door wouldn't open. Just like when you were a kid, you have to wait for the grown-ups to let you out. He scowled, but she saw the humor in the dim overhead light. Laugh it up. Oh, I am. Trust me. The guards took their time checking the area before opening their doors. Flanked by bodyguards, she stepped out of the SUV. Tate joined her on the sidewalk, studying the structure in front of them. Nice. All glass and sleek dark wood, the building on the corner lot was the picture of modern sophistication. She counted the layers of windows. 7 stories high, much narrower than it was tall. A dim light shone inside, where a security guard sat at a raised desk in the 2-story foyer, which was decked with gleaming marble floors and stacked stone walls. The words International Aid Foundation were etched on the fancy granite sign between the sidewalk and the entry. Misty backed up and peered down the street in both directions, taking in the neighborhood as a whole, and understood what Zachary Hardy had meant about the building not belonging there. The rest of the street was lined with brownstones similar to the one where Summer lived. Aged brick, ivy climbing the sides, old trees in small square lots. The 4-story buildings, each nestled against its neighbor, had no doubt been converted to apartments, but they were still homes. Not that there was anything wrong with sharing a block with an office building, but the IAF property wasn't the proverbial tulip in the onion patch. It was more like a tulip in a rose garden, because the brownstones were beautiful in their own way, aged and classic. The office building was beautiful too. It just didn't belong. Surely that wouldn't be enough to deny the permits, though. That was one of her favorite things about Boston, the way that old and the new existed side by side. The John Hancock buildings were the perfect example of that. The old one had a beacon that lit up different colors, sometimes even flashing, displaying the weather forecast. She forgot what all the different colors meant, but she knew that in winter, flashing red meant snow. During baseball season, it meant the Red Sox game was canceled, because Bostonians had their priorities. That old John Hancock building could be seen in the reflection of the new one, a 60-something story mirrored structure that was one of the defining towers in the Boston skyline. Old and new mixed easily in Boston, but both of those John Hancock buildings were in business centers, not on residential streets. She'd skimmed the information Hardy had sent her about the zoning, all the ways this property didn't fit. She'd thought it was strange he'd commented on parking. Boston wasn't exactly a driver's city. Most buildings didn't offer parking, at least not without a cost. But now she realized the problem. The road was lined with signs on both sides, warning drivers that the parking was for residents only. She searched on her phone and found there was no public parking within 5 blocks in any direction. Not a problem for city residents, most of whom relied on the T and buses to get around. But would the people visiting the International Aid Foundation be residents? Doubtful, but not a deal breaker. If refugees needed to come here, they could learn to use public transportation. Still, Hardy had mentioned other zoning issues, but the point was, the building didn't belong. And yet, here it was. Why? Why here and not in a more appropriate location? Why had the permits been issued? This hadn't happened by accident. Somebody somewhere had wanted this building in this spot. But why? Tate stood beside her, saying nothing, while the bodyguards hovered nearby. There were 4 of them, the 2 who'd been in her car, and 2 who'd driven a second SUV. She'd call it overkill if she hadn't been shot at 2 days before. "Let's walk a minute," she said. Tate slipped his hand in hers, and they meandered down the sidewalk, past the well-kept brownstones with their fancy brick and stone etchings, their wrought iron stair rails, their front yards smaller than a mid-sized sedan. It was a peaceful evening, very little traffic on the narrow city street. Aside from her, Tate, and the bodyguards, there were very few people around. "What do you think?" she asked. "It's a strange place for an office building." Ahead, a man and woman stepped outside one of the brownstones, descended the stairs, and hit the sidewalk, heading toward them. As they approached, Misty smiled and said to her bodyguard, "Can you step aside?" I'd like to talk to those people. The two men in front of her hurried to put more space between them. As soon as the couple skirted around the bodyguards, Misty said, "Pardon me? Can I ask you a question?" They stopped, eyeing the guards behind Misty and Tate before settling their gaze on her. They gave her cautious smiles. "You lost?" the man asked. "Just curious. That office building." Misty gestured to the corner. "What do you think about it?" The man looked at the woman, who tilted her head to one side. "It's pretty. It's a lot better than that ugly trailer." She turned to the man. "Remember that. It was there for years. If not for the construction company sign promising something was going to be built, I'd have worried it was there to stay." "Do you remember the name of the construction company?" Tate asked. "Read it every day, so I should." "Tanglewood?" She glanced at the man. "Right? That's that music venue," he said. "Out in the Berkshires." "Oh, right. It started with a T, though. And I know there were two O's. They kind of linked them on the sign. Bad graphics. I'm a designer. Thornwood?" "Thornbrook?" Tate suggested. The woman's eyes lit. "Yes. That was it. They had a trailer there for years, just sitting on the empty lot. I never complained about it because who has time? But I heard others on the block did, more than once. We were so happy when they finally started construction." "Do people come in and out of the place a lot?" Misty asked. The couple looked at each other before she shrugged. "Every day, I guess. Business people, or are there families? IAF runs a refugee home in Hopkinton. I'm just trying to figure out what they do in the city." "I've never seen families there," the woman said. "Suits, briefcases, that sort of thing." "That's very helpful," Misty said. "Thanks so much." The couple moved past them along the sidewalk. The neighborhood felt peaceful, homey. A group of teens congregated on the steps of one of the buildings. Misty smiled at a girl who looked about 13, and she smiled back. Seemed like a nice area. Probably in another couple of weeks when school started, it'd be more crowded. The proximity to a few of the many colleges in the city would make this a great place for students to live. Maybe that was the reason IAF wanted to be located here. Maybe they worked with university students. Maybe the woman just wasn't around when young people came and went. But didn't the organization focus on refugees? "I need to dig into IAF. Let's talk through it," Tate said. "What do we know?" Raoul Dawson attempted to bribe a city official to issue the permits and was arrested. For some reason, though the charges weren't dropped, the case languished for almost a year before it landed on my desk. "And now Dawson has a high-priced lawyer," Tate added. "Right, hired by somebody. Dawson, Thornbrook?" "IAF?" They walked in silence a few paces before Tate continued. "I looked up the building. They started building it a year ago, but according to that woman, Thornbrook had a trailer here for years." "Right. So first," Tate said, "why a big-time lawyer for a small-time case, and who's paying her?" "Not that we'll get the answer to that second part. And then there's Hardy, who reported Dawson's attempted bribery and was transferred out of the department. His replacement issued the permits, and the building was built. In a place where it probably shouldn't have been. Which begs the question, why here? And who works in this building?" "I was wondering that myself." At the end of the block, they crossed the street and turned back the way they'd come. They were missing something. As they approached the end of the block, she glanced up, looking for a crosswalk button. The names of the roads snagged her attention. She stepped back and stared. Aldous Street and Buttrick Road. "What's wrong?" Tate asked. "The streets." He looked at the two signs. "What about them?" The IAF building was on Buttrick Road, so that one didn't surprise her, but Aldous Street. She'd heard that name. She closed her eyes. Thought back. She'd been in her apartment. Tate had been there. They'd been talking about, isn't that where Freddie Parks was arrested? On Aldous Street? Tate's eyes widened. "I think so. We looked it up, remember? It was a corner lot, an empty lot, surrounded by brownstones." He looked around, taking in the area. "He was arrested here?" "Maybe, or near here." She nodded across the street at the place that, at the time of Parks's arrest, would have been an empty lot. An empty lot with a Thornbrook trailer on it. She paced down the sidewalk, trying to put the pieces together. Maybe somebody Parks knew worked for Thornbrook? So, we need to find out who owned the property at that time, Tate said. I'm guessing it was IAF. Even so, IAF wasn't here. Thornbrook was. She stopped to face him. Why would Parks come here? I don't know, but it can't be a coincidence. The concern on Tate's face was clear in the glow of the streetlight. Somehow, Freddie Parks is involved with this property, maybe with Dawson and all of it. Except he was in prison when Dawson offered that bribe. How could he be involved with that? Maybe Dawson recruited Parks to help with whatever they're doing, intimidating you, and there's got to be more to it than that. So what if the break-in at my apartment is related to Dawson? And Freddie Parks? Tate finished. Did you ever get in touch with his attorney? She shook her head, thankful for the bodyguards all around her. Something strange was going on, and the more information they got, the more confused she felt. Cofair never returned my calls. I think I'll pay him a visit tomorrow. Maybe he can tell me what's going on. Tell us, Tate said. You won't be going alone. Not that her bodyguards would allow that, but if Tate wanted to join her, she certainly wasn't going to turn him down. Having Tate with her made her feel safe, or at least safer, as she struggled to solve this mystery. They were nearly back to Summer's apartment when a call came in on Misty's cell phone. Ms. Lake, a man said after she answered. My name is Detective Klein with the Boston PD. I need to see you. Are you available? Now? She glanced at Tate, who was watching through squinted eyes. It's nearly 9 o'clock. It's important. The man's voice was low and smooth as maple syrup. I went to your apartment, but your building manager told me you are staying elsewhere for a few days. Are you in the city? I'm keeping my whereabouts quiet. Okay. She waited for him to ask why, but he didn't. After a moment, he said, I'd like you to come into police headquarters, or could we meet somewhere else? If you're nearby, that is. She had no desire to go back to police headquarters, that giant, sterile building. Hold on, detective. She muted her phone and gave Tate an update. Let's meet him at my apartment, Tate said, assuming he's still there. Good idea. She unmuted the phone. Detective Klein, are you still at my building? Close enough. Okay, my friend lives there as well. We'll be there soon. A couple of minutes later, as the bodyguards pulled the 2 SUVs over in front of her apartment building, a man in a suit pushed off from the stair rail leading to the front door. One of the bodyguards, Marcus, approached him. After a short chat and a long look at the detective's badge, he opened her door. Straight inside, ma'am. With Tate holding her hand, they entered the building. Ruth was standing near the mailboxes. I thought that was you. She eyed the crowd that had walked in with her. How are you? Everything okay? Yes, thanks for asking. Are you back then? I haven't seen you at your apartment, or anybody else, if that makes you feel better. Whoever they were, they haven't returned. Misty smiled at her nosy neighbor. Thanks for watching out for me. I've been checking for packages every day too. Nothing's come for you. Do you need anything? Can I do anything for you? Water your plants while you're gone, or... I think I've got it under control, but thanks. Misty gave the woman's elbow a quick squeeze and smiled as they walked by. She, Tate, the detective who'd yet to introduce himself, and 2 bodyguards piled into the elevator and rode silently to the 10th floor. This is cozy, Tate whispered, though everybody had to have heard. She managed to stifle a nervous laugh. Finally, he unlocked his door, and they stepped into his apartment. It looked different with the night sky on the far side of the window, the city twinkling below. Sophisticated. Tate flipped on the overhead lights. I'm Detective Klein. The man was older than Misty's father and had dark skin and black hair. His pale blue eyes were kind. She shook his hand. Misty Lake. And this is my friend, Tate Steele. The men greeted each other. I'm sorry to interrupt your evening, Klein said. It's not a problem. Tate moved into the living room and clicked on lamps, gesturing for her and the detective to follow. She sat on Tate's leather sectional, and Tate chose the spot next to her. As soon as Klein was settled catty-corner to them, he said, "When was the last time you spoke to Jeffrey Cofair?" The question took her aback. "He's a defense attorney, and I'm a prosecutor. We faced each other in court a couple of times, but it's been years. He works out of Lowell. I've been trying to reach him the last few days. I've left him a couple of messages, but he hasn't returned my calls. What's going on?" Klein's head bobbed slowly. Those unusual blue eyes focused on her. Though his expression was mild, she had a feeling he missed nothing. "Why were you trying to reach him?" "He left me a message last Friday night. I returned his call Saturday and spoke with his service, and then earlier this week, I left another one with his assistant." "Do you know why he was calling you?" "I used to work in Middlesex County. A man I put away up there, Frederick Parks, was released from prison on a technicality. Mr. Cofer's message said his call referred to Parks, so I assume he was calling to tell me Parks was free." "And that mattered to you because—" "Parks threatened me back when he was convicted." "I see." Klein looked at Tate, but she didn't follow his gaze. "Are you worried Frederick Parks might make good on his threat?" "I'm not sure what to think." She explained about how he'd reached out to her, and then sent her the note apologizing for his threats. And then she told Klein about the break-in at her apartment and the listening devices. "The detective working the case seems to think Parks is involved. Do you agree?" She shared a look with Tate, then shrugged. "We aren't sure what to think. I don't know why Parks would want to listen in on anything I have to say. Tate and I had scheduled a meeting that morning to discuss some of my cases. I think the break-in was related to one of those." "Who knew about that meeting?" "We sent a list to the detective working the case. She's been working through it, but it's a big list. As far as I know, she hasn't zeroed in on anybody." "Which detective?" "Reyes." "Good, she's good." "The thing is," Misty said, "we think it's possible that they're all related. A defendant in a bribery case I'm prosecuting, one Tate and I would have discussed in that meeting, may have known Parks. Or somebody at his company knew him, we think." She explained how he'd been arrested at the property Dawson had bribed the city official to sign off on. The detective's eyes narrowed to slits. "Wait, you're saying the guy who was released last week from prison is associated with one of your current cases?" "Maybe, or it's just a strange coincidence." Strange indeed." He stared beyond her a long moment, probably trying to fit the pieces together. At this point, the pieces didn't even seem to belong to the same puzzle. "Did something happen to Mr. Cofer?" One of Klein's shoulders lifted and fell. "He hasn't been to work since last Friday and hasn't called his assistant. He's divorced and lives alone, so nobody reported him missing. When his assistant couldn't reach him, she called the police. A couple of uniforms checked his house and found it empty." Tate leaned forward. "Any sign of forced entry? A scuffle?" "No, he's just not there. His mail hasn't been picked up in a few days. His neighbors haven't seen him. Nobody seems to know where he is." Misty asked, "And you reached out to me because—" "As far as anybody can tell, his call to you last week was the last one he made. Nobody's heard from him since." "Oh." She sat back, not sure what to think about that. "Have you looked for Parks?" "Cofer's assistant told us about him, so he's on our list. After this conversation, he'll be rising to the top." Klein turned his gaze on Tate. "Anything to add?" "I've never met Cofer or Freddie Parks." Tate glanced at her, almost as if asking permission. She gave him a go-ahead nod. "We've been digging around about a case involving a construction company called Thornbrook, a nonprofit called IAF, and a man named Raoul Dawson. He's the defendant Misty mentioned. Maybe Dawson and Parks knew each other? Maybe Dawson recruited Parks to help him break into her apartment. Though even then, why? To what end?" "Huh." Klein seemed to contemplate that. "Okay. Well, we don't have enough information to answer any of your questions." He pushed to his feet. "If you learn anything you think might help me find Mr. Cofer, would you let me know?" He held out a business card. Misty stood and took it. Of course. Will you let me know when you find him? I'll ask him to reach out. Klein shook their hands again. Thanks for seeing me. Enjoy the rest of your evening. After he left, she stared at the closed door. The bodyguard had walked out with the detective, leaving her and Tate alone. Something very odd is going on. I don't like it. The stormy look in Tate's eyes told her he was thinking the same. I definitely don't like that you're in the middle of it. No kidding, especially considering I don't even know what it is.